The first hard freeze came early that year. By the second week of November, the creek behind the mill had gone silent under 2 inches of ice, and the old men sitting outside Haggerty's dry goods store had stopped arguing about the weather and started worrying about it instead. Black Hollow wasn't a big settlement. Maybe 200 souls, a church that needed a new roof, a saloon that didn't, and a scattering of homesteads and ranches spread across the valley floor like stones thrown by a careless hand. Most years, winter came slow enough that people had time to get ready. This year it didn't bother with manners. Martha Keegan heard the freeze coming 3 days before it arrived. She couldn't have explained how she knew exactly. Something in the way the air tasted in the evenings, dry and sharp, like iron left out overnight. Something in the way the horses at the livery stood pressed together even when the weather was still mild. She'd lived alone long enough that she paid attention to things other people didn't bother with. When you had no one to talk to, you learned to read the world differently. She spent those 3 days stacking firewood against the back wall of her cabin, checking the gaps around her window frames, pulling her root vegetables from the ground and lining them up in the cellar with the care of someone who understood that what she put away now was what she'd eat in February. Her hands were rough from the work. They were always rough. That was another thing nobody particularly noticed about Martha Keegan, how much work those hands did and how quietly they did it. She was 34 years old, heavy-set in the way that made strangers look twice, then look away. Brown hair she kept pinned up because it was practical, not because she cared about how it looked. She owned 12 acres of rocky land on the eastern edge of town, a milk cow named Agnes, 4 chickens, and a cast-iron stove she'd inherited from her mother, and treated with more tenderness than most people gave their children. She was not beautiful. She had known this since she was old enough to understand what the word meant, and she had made a kind of peace with it the way you make peace with a scar. You stop expecting it to go away, and you find other things to think about. What Martha Keegan could do, what she had always been able to do, going back to when she was 8 years old standing on a stool beside her mother's stove, was cook, not just feed people. Cook. There was a difference, and anyone who'd eaten her food understood it immediately, even if they couldn't put words to why. She knew how long a stew needed before the meat stopped fighting the spoon. She knew how to make cornbread rise even with inferior flour, how to cure bacon so it didn't shrink to leather in the pan, how to stretch a modest cut of pork into a meal that left a man feeling like he'd been fed by someone who gave a damn about him. Her pies had a crust that people in Black Hollow still talked about, the way they talked about things that had happened to them once and never quite happened again. None of this made her popular. People ate what she brought to church socials and said, "Very good, Martha," and moved on. She was useful in the way a good tool is useful. You were glad to have it when you needed it, and you didn't think much about it otherwise. She had stopped going to the church socials 2 years ago, after an incident involving a comment made by Harshest that Martha hadn't quite been able to swallow. She hadn't made a scene about it. She'd just gathered her pie dish, walked home, and decided that some things weren't worth the trouble. That was who she was, mostly. A woman who decided things weren't worth the trouble and went home. Silas Boone arrived at her door on the Thursday before the big freeze, around 4 in the afternoon when the light had already gone thin and gray. She heard the horse first, a heavy animal, tired from the road. Then the knock, which was the knock of someone who wasn't sure of their welcome but was going to knock anyway. Martha dried her hands on her apron, moved the pot off the hot part of the stove, and opened the door. She knew who he was by sight. Everyone in Black Hollow knew Silas Boone by sight. He was a large man, not fat, but big in the shoulders, big in the way that suggested he'd spent most of his life doing things that required it. Somewhere in his early 40s, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and dark eyes that had the look of someone who had thought about a lot of things and not finished thinking about most of them. He owned Boone Ranch, which sat about 4 miles north of town along the creek bend. A proper operation, 160 acres with a bunkhouse, a barn, and a cattle herd that had been substantial until this past year started taking pieces of it. He had his hat in his hands, which she noticed. Men who kept their hats on at a woman's door were men who didn't think the woman warranted the courtesy. "Miss Keegan," he said. "It's Mrs.," she said out of habit, though Gerald Keegan had been dead 6 years and she'd spent 4 of those years trying to remember why she'd married him in the first place. "What can I do for you, Mr. Boone?" He looked at her steadily. He didn't look away in that particular fashion she'd gotten used to. the glance that took her in and then retreated to somewhere safer. He just looked at her the way you looked at someone you were trying to figure out. "I'll be direct with you," he said. "I've got 11 men in my bunkhouse. The winter coming is going to be a hard one, and I can feel it in my bones. 3 of those men are already running low. They came on late in the season, and they've eaten through what they brought. My cook left 2 weeks ago, quit without notice, and took himself to Denver. I've been doing the cooking myself, and I'm not good at it, and the men know it, and it's affecting things. Men who eat badly get short with each other." Martha said nothing. She waited. "I'm asking if you'd come out to the ranch," he said. "Cook for the outfit through the winter. I'll pay you a fair wage, same as I paid Dolan, my last cook, plus a share of the operation come spring if we make it through in decent shape. You'd have your own quarters in the main house. Agnes can come too if she produces." A pause. "I heard about your cooking from Roy Haggerty. He said you brought a beef stew to his family when his wife was sick last spring, and his kids didn't stop talking about it for a month." Martha was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was picking up, finding the gaps between the boards on her porch and whistling through them. "Mr. Boone," she said slowly, "I appreciate you coming in person, but I have to be honest with you. You're going to hear things from your men about bringing a woman like me onto a ranch. Not things about my cooking, things about how I look, and they won't be quiet about it." Silas looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not pity, which she would have hated, and not embarrassment, which would have been worse. It was something more like recognition, like he understood what she was actually saying. "Mrs. Keegan," he said, "I've got 11 men who ate bad biscuits for 2 weeks and are looking at a winter that's fixing to be the worst one in a decade. I'm not looking for someone beautiful. I'm looking for someone who can bring some life back to weary men. Roy Haggerty said you're the best cook in this county, and I believe him." He paused. "What other people think is their business. I've never run my operation based on other people's opinions." Martha looked at him for a long moment. "You understand it won't be easy," she said, "and not just because of the winter." "I never expected easy," he said. "Easy's for people with more luck than I've had." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "Give me until tomorrow morning," she said. "I have things to put in order." He nodded, put his hat back on, and turned to go. Then he stopped. "Mrs. Keegan," he said without turning around, "for what it's worth, I asked 2 other women before I came to you. They said no. I'm glad they did." He rode away before she could figure out what to say to that. Masit. She spent that night sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, thinking. She thought about the 11 men in the bunkhouse who were going to look at her the way men looked at her. That particular combination of disdain and amusement that she'd spent 30 years learning to absorb without showing that it landed. She thought about winter on a working ranch, which was hard work even for someone strong. And she was strong. But strong didn't mean she couldn't be broken down. She thought about 4 miles of road between herself and her cabin, which was hers, which was the one place in the world where nobody's opinion about her had any weight at all. Then she thought about what Silas Boone had said. "I'm looking for someone who can bring some life back to weary men." She had never been told, in her adult life, that she was the answer to anyone's problem. She had been told plenty of other things. She had been the subject of comments at socials and glances on the street, and a kind of casual dismissal that was worse than cruelty because it wasn't even personal. People didn't dislike her, they just didn't see any reason to look at her twice. She had made herself as small as someone her size could make herself, and she had filled her days with work and her evenings with silence, and she had been, in a way she didn't examine too closely, fine. But fine wasn't the same as alive. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she finally did sleep, she didn't dream about anything in particular, which was also something she was used to. In the morning, she packed a trunk. Boone Ranch in November looked like what it was, a working operation in the middle of hard season. The main house was solid, if not pretty. 2 stories of weathered timber with a wide front porch and a stone chimney throwing smoke against the gray sky. The barn was large and newer than the house, which told you something about Silas Boone's priorities. The bunkhouse sat to the east of the barn, low and long, with lamplight showing in 2 windows even at 9 in the morning. Silas met her in the yard. He helped her down from the wagon without making it into a production, which she appreciated. He showed her the kitchen. A big room off the back of the main house with a proper range, 2 work tables, a good dry larder, and a root cellar attached, and more pots and pans than she'd had since she left her mother's house. She stood in the middle of it and felt something she couldn't quite name settle into place behind her sternum. "I'll need a list of what you have in stores," she said. "Already wrote one out." He handed her a folded paper. She looked at it. "When do your men eat?" 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 at night. They're working through the freeze, so they need it substantial. "All right." She set the list on the work table. "Send someone for Agnes this afternoon. And Mr. Boone, I'll need authority over this kitchen, not suggestions. Authority." He didn't blink. "It is your kitchen," he said, and left her to it. The men came in for the noon meal that first day with the particular combination of curiosity and contempt that she had expected. She heard them before she saw them. The shuffle of boots on the porch, the low voices, the specific tone that men used when they were talking about something they thought was funny. She was already at the range when they filed in. She didn't turn around. There were 11 of them, young men and old men and men in between. Tom Greer, who was maybe 60, had a weathered face and the kind of stillness that came from decades of outdoor work. Hank Pryor, who was probably 20, had a raw, open face that showed everything he thought. Danny Rowe was somewhere in the middle, wiry, watchful, with quick eyes that took in a room before the rest of him arrived. The others she didn't know yet. She heard Hank Pryor say something under his breath to the man beside him. She couldn't make out the words, but she recognized the register. The snicker that followed was the same snicker she'd heard in different voices her whole life. She turned around. "Sit down," she said. Her voice was level, not friendly, not hostile, just a statement of fact, like it's cold outside or the creek's frozen over. "Food's ready." She put it on the table. Bean soup with ham hock, thick enough to stand a spoon in. Cornbread baked in the cast iron, golden on top, soft in the middle. Canned peaches she'd found in the back of the larder and cooked down with the little brown sugar she'd located in a tin behind the flour. They ate. She didn't watch them. She turned back to the range and started on preparations for supper, listening to the sounds behind her shift. The reluctant quiet of men who had started to say something and then discovered they were too busy eating to bother. Tom Greer was the first one to say anything worth hearing. "Ma'am," he said from the end of the table, his voice careful and deliberate. "That's the best cornbread I've eaten in about 4 years." She didn't turn around. "It'll be better tomorrow," she said. "I didn't have the oven temperature figured out yet." A pause. And then the sound of someone else reaching for another piece. Hank Pryor didn't quit that first week. She hadn't expected him to. He wasn't mean exactly, just young and thoughtless in the way that young men could be when nobody had ever asked them to think about it. He kept his comments mostly under his breath, but not entirely, and she heard enough of them to know the shape of what he thought about her. On the 4th day, he came into the kitchen in the late afternoon looking for something to eat between meals. She could see it in the way he was angling toward the bread tin. And she turned from the stove and said, without raising her voice, "If you want something before supper, ask me. Don't go through my things." He stopped. He looked at her. For a moment she could see him working out whether to push back. "I know what you were just," she said. "I'm not blind and I'm not stupid. If you're hungry between meals, ask me. I'll find you something, but you don't go through my kitchen uninvited. That's the rule." He stared at her for another moment. Then, unexpectedly, his ears went red. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She cut him a piece of bread and a slice of the cured ham she'd been resting and handed it to him without ceremony. He took it. He stood there for a second, holding it, and she could see him trying to work out where this situation had gone. "Thank you," he said finally, and it sounded genuine, which surprised her a little. "Eat it outside," she said. "I've got a floor to sweep." He went outside. He didn't snicker at her again, at least not where she could hear it. Danny Rowe was a different problem. Not because he was hostile. He wasn't, particularly. He was the kind of man who kept his own counsel and watched things with those quick, dark eyes of his. She noticed that he sat at the end of the table closest to the kitchen door, which meant he saw more of how she worked than the others did. She also noticed that he ate his food slowly and with attention, which was the sign of a man who actually tasted things. On the 5th day, he lingered after the others had gone back to work. "Mrs. Keegan," he said from the table. "What did you put in the gravy?" She glanced at him. "Why?" Because I spent 3 years eating at a cattle camp in Colorado where the cook made something that tasted something like that, and I never figured out what it was. Always bothered me. She considered. Worcestershire, she said, and a bit of the drippings from the pork I did 2 days ago. You save those. People throw them away, which is a waste. He thought about this. Huh, he said. Anything else? No. He stood up, took his hat from the peg by the door. Just curious. He paused with his hand on the door. Hank's an idiot, by the way. He don't mean anything by it. I know, she said. Thought you should know someone else knows it too, he said, and went out. She stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen, looking at the door he'd gone through, feeling something odd and small and fragile that she was careful not to look at too directly. Silas Boone stayed out of her kitchen. This she appreciated more than she could have articulated. Men who owned operations had a way of walking into spaces that weren't theirs and making them feel that way, commenting on how things were being done, offering suggestions that were really directives, standing in the middle of rooms and taking up all the air. Gerald had done it. Roy Haggerty's oldest boy did it, and he wasn't even grown yet. Silas didn't. He came in for his meals at the same times as the hands, sat at the head of the table, and ate. He said thank you when the meal was done, every single time. He asked her once during the first week whether she needed anything from town and wrote down what she told him without commentary. When she mentioned that the oven was running hot on the right side, he had a man look at it the next morning. She noticed these things. She noticed them the way you noticed a path through brush that was clear when you'd expected to have to fight for every step. With something like wariness, because clear paths sometimes had reasons for being clear. On the 8th day, she was up before 4 in the morning. She was always up early, the habit of years. And she found him already in the main room, sitting at the desk by the window with a lantern and a ledger open in front of him. He looked up when she came through with her arms full of firewood for the kitchen stove. Let me get that, he said, starting to rise. I've got it, she said. He sat back down. He watched her carry it through to the kitchen, and when she came back for the second armful she'd left on the porch, he was still at his desk, but he'd refilled the lamp. She made coffee. When it was done, she poured 2 cups. She wasn't sure why she did this. She wasn't the kind of woman who made gestures, and set one on the corner of his desk as she passed. He looked at it, then up at her. Thank you, he said. She went back to her kitchen. She didn't know what to do with the feeling she was carrying, so she put it somewhere out of the way and started on biscuit dough, which was the kind of work that required your hands and nothing else. The first real cold came down on the 11th day. Not the preliminary freeze, the actual winter, the kind that didn't apologize for itself. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours. Wind came down off the ridge with enough force to make the timbers of the main house groan. The cattle in the far pasture had to be moved, and all 11 hands went out before dawn and didn't come back until well past noon, and when they came back they were half frozen and too tired to talk. Martha had seen it coming. She'd been cooking for 4 hours before they got back. A proper beef stew with root vegetables and barley, thick enough to be almost solid, with fresh bread to go alongside and a pot of coffee that she kept hot and refilled every time someone emptied it. She'd also, without quite planning to, made a pan of her mother's apple pudding, the one she'd grown up making when the weather turned hard, because it was the kind of food that did something to a person's insides that went past just being warm. The men came in and sat down without a word, and they ate. Nobody talked for a long time. Outside, the wind went on doing what it was doing. Inside, the stove threw heat and the lamps burned low, and Martha moved back and forth between the kitchen and the table, keeping things filled, watching the color come back into faces that had been the color of old ash when they came in. Tom Greer ate 2 full bowls of stew and a large portion of the pudding, and then sat back in his chair with an expression that she could only describe as undone. The look of a man who had been braced for something hard, and found, instead, something that reminded him of things he'd been keeping at a distance. Mrs. Keegan, he said, and his voice was rough from more than the cold. My mother used to make something like this. She looked at him. Apple pudding? Not exactly. He shook his head slowly. But something. He stopped. I don't know. It's been a long time since a meal tasted like someone made it for me specifically. She didn't know what to say to that. She said, There's more if you want it, and went back to the kitchen because that was the only language she trusted herself to use right then. She stood at the range for a moment with her eyes closed and her hands flat on the work table. 11 men, all of them sitting in that room because of what she'd done with a stove and a bag of flour and a side of beef and some carrots she'd pulled from the cellar. Sitting in that room, not looking away from her, not talking around her, not deciding she wasn't worth the attention. Just eating. It was a small thing. She knew that. In the scale of what mattered in a person's life, feeding people was not a grand gesture. But she had spent a very long time being invisible, and there was something about being seen. She put more water on to boil. She had dishes to wash and bread to set for the morning, and the cold wasn't going anywhere, and the men would be hungry again by 6 o'clock. She got to work. Oh, late that night, after everyone had gone to bed and the wind had dropped to something more bearable, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the sound of the house settling around her. She could hear, faintly, the cattle in the barn, the low sounds they made when they were cold but not panicking. She could hear the tick of the stove as it cooled. She thought about her cabin on the eastern edge of town, about Agnes in the barn here, who had already made friends with the ranch's other animals in the way that cows did when they were moved somewhere new, with a kind of resigned, philosophical acceptance. She thought about the 12 acres she'd left behind, frozen and quiet under their sheet of ice. She thought about a coffee cup left on the corner of a desk before dawn. She told herself to stop thinking about that particular thing. She was 34 years old. She had been treated, for most of those years, as someone who took up space that might have been better used by someone more agreeable to look at. She had learned to want carefully, to reach for things that were within arm's distance and not further. She had gotten good at being practical. Silas Boone was not within arm's distance. He was a rancher with a working operation and a reputation and a future to think about, and she was the cook, and she had not gotten this far by being stupid about what was and wasn't hers to want. She finished her tea. She washed the cup. She went to bed. Outside, the wind had gone quiet, and Black Hollow sat frozen and still under a sky crowded with stars. And in the bunkhouse, 11 men slept better than they had in 2 weeks. And in the main house, a man sat for a while longer at his desk before he closed his ledger and blew out his lamp. And the winter that had come early and hard to the valley had not yet shown all its intentions, and there were things still coming, good things and hard things, and things that nobody, not even someone who could feel a freeze 3 days before it arrived, could have seen in time to prepare for. But that was later. For now, the stove held its heat, the bread was set to rise by morning, and Martha Keegan, for the first time in longer than she could quite account for, did not feel invisible. The bread rose overnight the way she'd expected it to, and she was pulling it from the oven before 5 in the morning when she heard the first sounds from the bunkhouse. Boots on floorboards, a door dragging open against the cold, someone coughing in the gray dark outside. The ranch woke up the same way every morning, reluctant and then committed, like a man who's decided to get up but hasn't fully convinced his body yet. She had the table set and the coffee ready when Tom Greer came in first the way he always did, 5 minutes before the others, which she'd learned was his habit, not because he was eager, but because he liked a moment of quiet before the noise started. He was old enough to have earned that preference, and he took it without apology. "Morning," he said, hanging his coat on the peg. "Morning." She set a cup in front of him without being asked. He'd been drinking his coffee the same way for 40 years. Black, no sugar, and she'd learned it in the first 2 days. He wrapped both hands around the cup and sat there, and neither of them said anything, and that was fine. The others came in a few at a time. Hank Pryor came in with his hair uncombed, which was every morning. Danny Rowe came in after him, already alert, already watching the room. 3 brothers named Caldwell, Will, Joe, and the youngest, Pete, who was maybe 17 and had a bruise on his jaw that he never explained and that nobody asked about directly, came in together like they always did, taking the same 3 chairs at the middle of the table. She put food in front of them. Eggs scrambled with the last of the preserved peppers she'd brought from her own stores. Fried salt pork. Biscuits. The bread from the oven, still warm enough to melt butter without effort. Hank Pryor looked at his plate and then looked up at her, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something she'd have to respond to. Instead he said, "Is that actual pepper in the eggs?" "It is." "Huh." He picked up his fork. "That's different." Different bad or different good? He thought about it with the seriousness of a young man who didn't want to say the wrong thing to someone who controlled his food. "Different good," he said carefully. She went back to the range. Behind her, she could hear the breakfast sounds. The scrape of forks, the thump of the bread being passed down the table, someone asking someone else to move their elbow. Normal sounds. Working ranch in winter sounds. She had grown up with sounds like these in the background, and she hadn't realized until recently how much their absence had weighed on the mornings in her cabin. The door at the back of the kitchen opened and Silas came in from outside, which was not his usual pattern. He was carrying something, a crate of potatoes he'd apparently hauled from the external cellar himself, which she hadn't asked him to do. Cold storage was getting low on the shelves you can reach, he said, setting the crate down by the work table. Figured you'd need these. She looked at the crate, then at him. His coat was dusted with ice crystals from the cellar entrance, and he had a piece of straw caught in his collar that he hadn't noticed. Thank you, she said. You've got straw on you. He looked down, brushed at his collar, missed it. Other side, she said. He found it. He held it for a second, looking at it, then dropped it on the floor and went through to the main room to eat, and she stood by the work table feeling the faint, absurd warmth of a moment that had no business meaning anything. She got the potatoes sorted. There was work to do. What she hadn't anticipated, and she should have, she told herself later, she should have seen it coming, was Hank Pryor's friend. His name was Cal Decker. He wasn't part of the regular outfit. He was a man Hank had grown up with in some town 2 counties over, and he showed up on the ranch on the 14th day, nominally to help with the cattle during the freeze, and actually, as best Martha could tell, because he had nowhere better to be. Silas tolerated him the way he tolerated most inconveniences, without enthusiasm, but without unnecessary conflict. Cal Decker was the kind of man who talked too much at mealtimes and laughed at his own jokes before they were finished. He was not specifically cruel, just careless in the way that men who had never been asked to be careful could be careless. He had a way of looking at Martha that she recognized and hated. Not leering, nothing that direct, just a kind of frank assessment followed by a conclusion that he apparently saw no reason to keep to himself. On his 3rd day at the table, while she was bringing out the noon meal, he said to the man beside him, just loud enough, I see now why Dolan left. Can't imagine cooking being the only thing keeping a woman employed. There was a beat of silence around the table, the kind that happened when a room decides whether something is funny or not. Martha set the pot of stew down on the table. She set it down carefully, without hurry, and then she straightened up and looked at Cal Decker directly. He was still smiling at his own observation. Mr. Decker, she said. Her voice came out even. She was grateful for that. You're a guest at this table. The food in front of you was made by me with my hands starting at 4 this morning. You're welcome to eat it or not eat it. Either way, I'll ask you to keep your opinions about my employment to yourself while I'm in the room. Decker blinked. He hadn't expected her to answer. I heard what you were just, she said. Hank Pryor, beside him, had gone very still, and Martha noticed that he did not laugh and did not look at Decker with any particular solidarity. She filed that away. Enjoy your meal. She went back to the kitchen. Behind her, she could hear the sound of spoons going into bowls, and then the low sound of someone, she thought it was Danny Rowe, saying something she couldn't hear, and then Decker saying, all right, in the tone of a man who had realized too late that the room wasn't with him. She stood at the range and breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate, until her hands stopped feeling like they wanted to shake. She was not ashamed of what she'd said. She wasn't going to be. But there was something exhausting about having to say it at all, about spending energy on something that shouldn't have needed energy, that should have been handled by basic decency before it ever reached her. She heard the kitchen door open and thought, if that's Decker coming to apologize, I don't have the patience. But it was Tom Greer. He stood in the doorway with his bowl. She saw he'd come to get a second helping, which meant she'd made enough and the stew had held up. And he looked at her with those weathered eyes that never showed much but somehow showed everything. You did right, he said. She turned back to the stove. I did what was necessary, she said. It's not the same thing. He considered this. Maybe not, he said. He held out his bowl. Can I get more of this? She ladled it. He took it. He went back to the table, and she heard him say something to Decker in a low, flat voice, the kind of voice that didn't invite discussion, and after that, Decker ate his meal without talking. She did not mention it to Silas. It wasn't his problem to manage, and she wasn't going to make it one. That was her own rule, one she'd made long ago. You handle what's in your space. You don't outsource your dignity to someone else. What happened 3 days after that was not something she'd engineered. She wanted to be clear with herself about that later. She hadn't set up the moment or aimed for it. It just arrived, the way things sometimes did, in the gap between the life you were living and the one you were bracing against. It was a Sunday. The men had a lighter schedule, fence checking in the morning, and then a few hours in the afternoon that was as close to free time as a working ranch allowed in winter. Some of them played cards in the bunkhouse. Pete Caldwell, the youngest, usually sat by the window and whittled, which he did with the concentration of someone who needed something to do with his hands, or they'd get him into trouble. Danny Rowe read actual books, which he kept in a saddlebag and traded with the hands from neighboring outfits when someone passed through. Martha spent her Sundays the same way she spent the rest of the week, because kitchens didn't take Sundays off. But she gave herself slightly more time between meals, and she sometimes sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon with whatever mending needed doing. That afternoon, she was sitting with a shirt of Tom Greer's. A seam had gone on the shoulder, when Pete Caldwell appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a moment, not saying anything, in the way of a 17-year-old who had thought of a reason to come somewhere and was now uncertain whether it was a good reason. "Pete," she said, without looking up from the mending, "you need something?" "No, ma'am." A pause. "I was just... Could I sit in here? It's loud in the bunkhouse." She looked up then. He had his whittling in his hand, a piece of pine he'd been working into something. She wasn't sure what yet. He had that bruise on his jaw still, yellowing now at the edges. "Sit down," she said. "Just don't put your shavings on my floor." He found a stool in the corner and pulled it to the side of the work table and sat down. And for a while they were both just quiet, her with the mending, him with his knife and his piece of pine, and the stove making its quiet sounds. After about 20 minutes, he said, without looking up, "Mrs. Keegan, how did you learn to cook like that?" She tied off a stitch. "My mother started when I was 8. Did you always know you were good at it?" She thought about this honestly. "No. You never know you're good at something until someone tells you, and sometimes they take a long time telling you." She cut the thread. "What is that you're making?" He held it up. It was a bird. Rough still, the wings not quite right, but recognizably a bird. "A sparrow," he said. "For my sister. She likes sparrows." "She back in town?" "Yes, ma'am." He turned the wood in his hands. "Back in Millhaven. I send her things when I can." Martha looked at him. This boy with his bruised jaw and his pine sparrow and his sister back in Millhaven, and something turned over slowly in her chest. "You're a good brother," she said, and meant it, and went back to the mending. He sat with her for another hour, neither of them talking much, and when he left he said thank you, Mrs. Keegan, with a sincerity that she felt somewhere she hadn't expected to feel anything, but some. The thing about respect was that it didn't arrive like a proclamation. It arrived in small adjustments, barely noticeable on their own, but cumulative in a way that you felt before you could identify it. It arrived in the way that Hank Pryor started warning her before the men came in late. "We got held up at the north fence, Mrs. Keegan. Be another half hour." Instead of just showing up and expecting the meal to be there. It arrived in the way that Will Caldwell started wiping the table down after meals without being asked, which had been nobody's job before, and was now apparently his. It arrived in the way that Danny Rowe, on the days when she was at the range and her hands were full, would quietly refill the coffee pot without her having to think about it. None of them said anything about it directly. They were ranch hands, not men who made speeches. But the calibration of the room had shifted, and she felt it. Cal Decker lasted 9 more days and then left, citing reasons that nobody examined too closely. She saw him ride out one morning and felt the specific relief of a problem that has solved itself. What she didn't know how to calibrate was Silas. He remained throughout the 2nd and 3rd weeks, the same thing he had been since the first day, present without being intrusive, consistent without being predictable. He ate his meals. He said thank you. He mentioned one morning that the east pasture fence had held through the last wind and he thought it would make it to spring, and the way he said it, not to anyone in particular, just into the room, sounded like someone who had been carrying a worry and was setting it down for a moment. She found herself one evening asking him a question she hadn't planned. She was clearing the supper things, and he was still at the table with his coffee. He often stayed at the table after the others left, with his coffee and his thoughts. And she said, without turning around, "How long has the ranch been in trouble?" A pause. She heard him set down the cup. "What makes you think it's in trouble?" he said. His voice was careful but not defensive. "The ledger you keep at night," she said. "The fact that you're feeding 11 men on stores that are stretched thin. The fact that you went and found me yourself instead of sending someone." Another pause. "About a year," he said. "The winter before last took 60 head of cattle. Then spring flooded the south pasture and we lost the hay crop. Then Dolan left and the men started eating badly and working worse." He was quiet for a moment. "I've had hard years before, but not all in a row," she said. "No," he said. "Not all in a row." She turned around. He was looking at his coffee cup, not at her, and in the lamplight he looked tired in a way that the daylight hid. The particular tiredness of someone who has been holding things together by force of will for long enough that they can't quite remember what it felt like to not be doing that. "The cattle you have left," she said. "If we keep the feed ration the way I've been managing the kitchen stores, and if the spring comes before—" "I know the arithmetic," he said, not unkindly, just truthfully. "Then you know it's close," she said, "but it's not gone." He looked up at her then. It was a direct look, the same one he'd given her on her front porch that first day, that hadn't flinched or retreated. "No," he said, "it's not gone." She went back to clearing the table. She didn't know why she'd said any of that. She wasn't in the habit of talking about things that weren't her business. But there was something about watching a man carry weight in silence that made her want to acknowledge it, even obliquely, even in a conversation that was really about something else. "Mrs. Keegan?" he said. Why did you say yes when I asked you?" She stopped. She thought about the night she'd sat at her kitchen table with the cold tea, thinking about what he'd said. "I'm looking for someone who can bring some life back to weary men. Because I was tired of being invisible," she said. And then, before the words could sit there in the open air and mean too much, she picked up the stack of bowls and carried them to the kitchen. She heard him get up from the table a few minutes later. She heard him walk to the window, then to the door, then stop. "I'm glad you said yes," he said from the doorway. He went to his desk. She washed the dishes. Outside, the cold had settled into the kind of deep quiet that meant the temperature was still dropping, and the house made its low sounds around her, and she stayed at the wash basin longer than she needed to, letting the water go cool around her hands. It was Tom Greer who said the thing out loud that everyone else had been not saying. He came to her on a Wednesday afternoon in early December while she was rendering lard, a slow, unglamorous process that took most of the afternoon and left the kitchen smelling of something that was not unpleasant, but was not pretty either. He sat down at the table and watched her work for a while before he spoke. "You know what they're saying in town," he said. She didn't look up. "I imagine I can guess." "Probably." He folded his hands on the table. Tom Greer was a man who thought before he spoke, which she respected. "They're saying Silas has lost his sense, bringing a woman like you out to a working ranch." She stirred the pot. "And what does a woman like me mean to them?" "You know what it means." He said it without apology. He was too old to dress up hard things as soft ones. "They're talking about your size, about the fact that you're a widow, about whether it's proper. It's a cook's position," she said. "You know that's not all they're talking about," he said. "And so do you." She stopped stirring. She looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching. "Tom," she said, "I've been managing other people's opinions about my appearance since I was 12 years old. I've gotten fairly efficient at it. I know that." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not saying it to warn you. You don't need warning. I'm saying it because—" He stopped. Started again. "Because I've been on this ranch for 11 years, and I've seen Silas Boone in a lot of different states, and I've never seen him stay at a supper table after the meal was done until you came." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the lard. "Tom," she said, "I'm going to need you to not say things like that to me." "Why not?" "Because I have a job to do," she said, "and I'm going to do it. And I'm not going to let myself start thinking about things that are going to make the job harder." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a very practical answer." "I'm a practical woman." "Yes," he said. "You are." He got up from the table. "I'll let you get on with it." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Keegan, and I know you'll tell me it isn't worth much, you're the best thing that's happened to this outfit in about 2 years. And not just because of the food." He went out before she could respond. She stood at the stove with the lard rendering down slowly, and she did not let herself think about what he'd said. She thought about the temperature of the pot and the color of the fat and whether she had enough salt for the week. And she thought about those things with the focused attention of a woman who has learned that the mind is a room you can choose to stay in or step out of, and she stayed firmly where the work was. But that night, lying in the small room off the back of the main house that was hers now, with Agnes in the barn and her cast iron stove in the kitchen and 11 men sleeping in the bunkhouse who ate better than they had before she arrived, she let herself feel, for exactly 1 minute, the fragile and complicated and entirely inconvenient thing that she had been storing in the back of her chest for 2 weeks. 1 minute. And then she put it away, turned onto her side, and slept. The winter was not finished with them yet. She knew that. You could feel it in the air even on the still nights. The held breath of something larger still gathering itself out beyond the ridge, patient in the way that cold was patient, waiting for the moment when you started to believe it might hold off. She had learned not to believe that. She had learned in her life not to believe that the hard thing had passed just because you couldn't see it anymore. But she had also learned, and this was newer, this was something still being formed in the part of her that had started to change since she came to Boone Ranch, that not believing in relief was different from refusing to accept warmth when it was actually there, in front of you, offering itself without condition. She slept. Outside, the temperature dropped another 4 degrees, and somewhere out past the North Ridge, something large and cold and indifferent to the lives of people was beginning to move. The thing that had been gathering itself out past the North Ridge arrived on a Tuesday. Martha felt it in her sleep. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in pressure, the way the air shifted when something large moved through it. She was awake before 4, before the alarm she set in her head every night, and when she pulled back the curtain on the small window of her room, she couldn't see anything. Not the barn, not the bunkhouse, not the fence line 20 feet from the house. Just white, white moving sideways, white moving up, white that had no direction because the wind was coming from everywhere at once. She dressed fast. She got the kitchen stove going and put water on and stood at the back door for a moment, listening to the sound the blizzard was making. A low, continuous roar that was not like wind she'd heard before. Not the gusting kind that came and went, but a sustained thing. The sound of weather that had decided it was done being polite. She went and knocked on Silas's door. He opened it in maybe 4 seconds, which told her he'd already been awake. He was dressed except for his coat. He looked at her face and then passed her toward the kitchen window, where the darkness outside was a different texture than it should have been. "How bad?" he said. "Can't see the barn," she said. He was past her and moving for his coat before she finished the sentence. Within 20 minutes, the bunkhouse was up. She could hear Silas's voice out there, cutting through the wind. Short directives, no wasted words. She couldn't make out what he was saying, but she knew the tone. "This is what we do. In this order, move." She put more wood on the fire and started on the biggest pot of oatmeal she could manage, because men going out into that weather needed something hot in them that would stay hot. And she set a second pot on for coffee and then a third with water for when they came back and needed their hands warmed before they could feel their fingers enough to eat. Tom Greer came in first, just briefly, to relay what Silas had said. Half the men to the barn to manage the horses and cattle, the other half working the fence line closest to the herd to make sure nothing panicked through it. He'd be out there himself. She should keep the fires going and have food ready when they came back. "How long?" she said. "Don't know." He was already pulling his collar up. "Storm like this could be all day." She nodded. She didn't say be careful because it wasn't useful, and he knew the stakes better than she did. She handed him a folded cloth with 2 biscuits in it. She'd had them ready without thinking about it, and he took them without breaking stride. The door shut behind him, and she was alone in the kitchen with the sound of the blizzard pressing against every wall. She kept busy the way she always kept busy, which was methodically and without drama. She built the fires up in both the kitchen and the main room. She checked the water barrels, full, She'd filled them 2 days ago, when the pressure in the air changed, and she'd started quietly preparing for something, though she hadn't said so. She went to the cellar and brought up more root vegetables, more dried beans, a second sack of cornmeal. She checked the lamp oil. She pulled every spare blanket she could find out of the chest in the hallway and put them near the fire to warm. Around 7 in the morning, she thought she heard something. She wasn't sure at first. The storm was loud enough that it filled up the inside of her head, that constant roar, and everything inside it sounded uncertain. But she stood still at the kitchen work table and held her breath and listened. There it was, not the storm. Something inside the storm. A thinner sound, high and irregular, that the wind was chopping into pieces, but that was unmistakably coming from a specific direction. From the east side of the property, near the old equipment shed that hadn't been used in 2 seasons. She stood there for probably 10 seconds trying to tell herself she'd imagined it. Then she put on her coat. She put on her wool hat and her 2 pairs of mittens, and she wrapped a length of burlap around her shoulders over the coat because it was all she had. She went to the back door. The wind hit her like a wall. Not a figure of speech, an actual physical thing that pushed her back a step before she got her footing. The cold was the kind that didn't feel cold at first. It felt like pressure, like the air was trying to compress her from all sides. She couldn't see more than 8 feet in any direction. She knew the property well enough by now. 14 steps from the back door to the corner of the woodpile. Turn left there. Follow the fence line with her left hand on the post tops. Count 11 posts to the corner, then turn again, and the shed was another 30 feet out. She'd walked it in the dark before. Not in this, but the geometry was the same. She put her left hand on the first fence post and started counting. The wind found every gap in her clothing. By the time she reached the 5th post, she couldn't feel her left cheek. By the 8th post, she was leaning into the wind at an angle that felt ridiculous, like something was wrong with gravity. The burlap was useless, snapping and pulling. She held the fence post at the corner with both hands for a moment, just to not blow sideways, and she thought about going back. Then she heard it again. Clearer now, without the house between her and the shed. A child. She let go of the post and went toward the sound. Bob. He was in the gap between the back wall of the shed and an old water trough that had tipped on its side years ago and nobody had righted. The trough had created a small windbreak. Not much, but enough to survive in for an hour or 2. He was maybe 6 years old, dressed for the cold, but not for this cold. His coat too thin for a storm of this severity, and he had curled himself into the smallest shape he could manage with his arms wrapped around his knees. When she reached him, he was shaking so hard she could feel it through her mittens when she touched his shoulder. His eyes were open, but not quite focusing. "Hey," she said, close to his ear, loud enough to cut through the wind. "Look at me. Can you look at me?" He turned his head. His eyes found her face. "I'm going to carry you," she said. "I need you to hold on to me. Can you do that?" His teeth were chattering too hard to answer, but his arms moved when she pulled him up and got him against her chest, and he pressed his face into her neck with the blind instinct of a small creature looking for warmth. She was not a small woman. She had never in her adult life thought of her size as an advantage. She thought about it now. The weight of her, the mass of her against the wind, the way her body could wrap around something smaller and keep it from the cold. She pulled him in tight and turned back toward the fence line. Getting back was harder than getting out. The wind had shifted while she was in the shelter of the shed, and it was hitting her from a different angle now, and she had the boy's weight in her arms and couldn't use the fence post the same way. She miscounted somewhere in the middle and ended up 2 steps off from where she expected to be and lost a full minute in the white confusion before she found the woodpile corner. Her arms were burning. Not from cold, from the effort, the sustained effort of carrying something and staying upright and moving forward at the same time. She thought about putting him down for a moment and decided against it immediately. If she put him down, she wasn't sure she'd get him up again fast enough. She found the back door by feel, pushed it open. The heat of the kitchen came at her like a wave and she nearly went to her knees. She got him to the floor in front of the stove, kept her own knees under her through pure stubbornness, and pulled off his wet outer coat with hands she couldn't quite feel. "Okay," she said, to herself as much as to him. "Okay. You're inside. You're all right." She got blankets from the pile she'd warmed by the fire. She wrapped him in 2 of them. She pulled off his boots, soaked through, his socks the same, and rubbed his feet between her own hands, which still had some warmth in them, until she felt him flinch, which meant feeling was coming back, which meant no frostbite setting in yet. "What's your name?" she said. He looked at her. He was still shaking, but it was coming down in intensity. "Jacob," he said. His voice was a thread. "Jacob, where's your family?" "My ma." He swallowed. "We were at the Henley farm. I went to look for the dog." He stopped. His eyes filled up. "I couldn't find the dog." "The Henley farm is 2 miles from here," she said, keeping her voice level. "I know." He looked miserable. "I got turned around." She put her hand on the side of his face. He was warming up. Not fast enough yet, but warming. "You're going to be all right," she said. "We're going to get you warm, and then when the storm lets up, we're going to get you back to your ma. She's going to be very relieved to see you." "She's going to be real mad," he said. "Probably both," Martha said. "That's what mothers do." She made him drink warm broth. She had some on the back of the stove. She always had something on the back of the stove. Just small sips at first, then more as the shaking subsided. She stayed on the floor beside him, which was not comfortable, and she didn't move until some of the color came back into his face and his eyes stopped having that hollow, unfocused look that had frightened her more than anything else. She was sitting there on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and a blanket-wrapped 6-year-old leaning into her arm when the back door opened and Silas Boone came in. He was coated in ice, literally, ice crystals across his shoulders and hat brim, his beard frozen at the edges. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the boy. He looked at her. He looked at her coat, which was still on, which was still dripping snowmelt onto the floor. "You went out in that," he said. It was not a question. "I heard him," she said. "You went out in that," he said again. Something was moving behind his eyes that wasn't anger, but was adjacent to it. The feeling you got when someone you cared about had done something that could have gotten them killed. "He was in the equipment shed," she said. "He couldn't have lasted much longer." Silas stood in the doorway for a long moment, dripping ice. Then he came fully inside and crouched down on one knee to look at Jacob, who looked back at him with the evaluating gaze of a child assessing a large, unfamiliar man. "You from the Henley place?" Silas said. "Yes, sir." "Your ma's name?" "Ruth Henley." Silas nodded. He stood up. He looked at Martha again, and this time the thing behind his eyes had shifted into something she didn't have a name for, but that she felt in the center of her chest like a hand pressing flat. "I'll get word to the Henleys when the storm breaks," he said. "He'll stay here until then." "I know," she said. He went back out into the storm. She sat on the floor with the boy a while longer. Her arms ached. Her left cheek, the one that had gone numb, was making itself known now in a way that was going to be unpleasant by evening. She thought about the count she'd miscounted, the 2 steps off, the minute lost in the white, and she thought about what would have happened if she'd lost the fence line entirely. She didn't let herself think about it for long. What might have been was a room she'd learned not to spend time in. Jacob fell asleep against her arm around 9 in the morning. She eased him down onto the blankets and got up, creaking, and went back to the stove. There were men going to come in from the cold all day, and they were going to need feeding. She put the kettle on. She started cutting potatoes. But the story of what she'd done made it around the ranch before the storm fully broke, which was sometime in the late afternoon when the wind dropped from a roar to a sustained moan, and you could see, if you stood at the window, the outline of the barn against the white. She didn't spread it herself. She suspected Tom Greer had pieced it together from the wet coat on the hook and the child in the kitchen. And Tom was not a gossip, but he was a man who thought that certain things deserved to be known. The men came in that evening in stages. The ones from the barn first, then the fence crew, Silas last. They were all exhausted in a way that went past the body into something closer to the core. She'd made a proper pot roast, slow-cooked since noon, with every root vegetable she had, and a sauce built from the drippings and some of the canned tomatoes she'd been saving. She put it on the table and stepped back. Jacob ate with them. He had recovered enough to be curious about the ranch hands, and by the time supper was half done, he had worked his way into a conversation with Pete Caldwell about the sparrow whittling, which apparently fascinated him. Hank Pryor, across the table, kept looking at Martha. Not in the way he'd looked at her in the first week. That had been the look of a young man deciding what category she belonged in. This was different. He had the expression of someone who had revised an opinion and was still adjusting to the revision. After the meal, when most of the men had gone back to the bunkhouse and Martha was clearing the table, Hank stopped in the doorway. "Mrs. Keegan," he said. She looked at him. "What you did today?" He stopped. He was not a man who had a lot of practice saying things directly. "That was, nobody else went out in that." "I heard him," she said. "We all heard the storm," he said. "You're the one who went out in it." She didn't know what to say to that, so she picked up a stack of plates. "I just wanted to say," he said, I wasn't. He stopped again. His ears were going red. "I wasn't always right about you. At the start, when I said things." He looked at the floor. "That wasn't right." She looked at him for a moment. 20 years old, maybe, with his hat in his hands and his ears red, trying to find his way to the other side of something he'd said that he wished he hadn't. "Hank," she said, "it's done." "I know, but it's done," she said again. Not hard, not forgiving exactly, because forgiveness implied she'd been keeping score, and she hadn't. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last, but I appreciate you saying it." He nodded. He looked relieved in the way of someone who has put down something heavy. He went out. She stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen, holding the plates. 3 days later, Vivian Cross rode into Black Hollow. Martha didn't know who she was at first. She was in the dry goods store. Silas had taken her to town to resupply after the storm, and she was working through her list with Roy Haggerty, who was the kind of shopkeeper who took inventory seriously and would sometimes argue about whether you really needed what you thought you needed. When the bell above the door rang and the temperature of the room changed, not the air temperature, the other kind. She turned around because Roy Haggerty's expression had shifted in a specific way. The look of a man who has just seen something that is going to require him to take a side eventually. The woman who came through the door was tall and narrow in the way that Black Hollow's unforgiving winters seem to preserve in certain women, as if the cold had stripped everything unnecessary away and left only the essential architecture. She was dark-haired, maybe 35, dressed well enough to indicate that she had not been doing without. She had the kind of face that people called striking, which was different from beautiful, because beautiful implied something passive, and this face was not passive. It was a face that knew what rooms it walked into and what effect it had, and had decided to keep having it. She looked around the store. Her gaze moved across Martha in the way that a gaze moved across furniture. "Roy," she said, "tell me Silas Boone is still in town." "He's at the feed store," Roy said carefully. "Vivian, this is—" "I'll find him," she said, and went back out the door. Roy Haggerty set down the can of beans he'd been holding. "That's Vivian Cross," he said in the tone of a man reading a weather report. "I gathered," Martha said. "Who is she?" Roy was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing how much to say. "She and Silas were— There was an understanding, about 3 years ago. She left for San Francisco, took up with a man who turned out to have more money than morals, if you follow. I heard he died last spring." He looked at the door. "I imagine she's heard Silas is still running the ranch." Martha set her list on the counter. She looked at it without reading it. "Finish the order, please, Roy," she said. "I'll wait." She stood at the counter and waited, and she did not think about what was happening at the feed store, and she did a reasonable job of it. She found out what happened at the feed store from Danny Rowe, who had been there helping load grain and had a sharp eye for things. He told her that evening, in the kitchen, while she was making biscuits, he'd come in for coffee and stayed longer than the coffee required, which was how she knew he had something to say. Silas talked to her for about 10 minutes, Danny said. She did most of the talking. He listened. Then he said something I couldn't hear, and she didn't look happy about it, and then he went back to loading grain. Martha rolled the dough. "That's all?" "That's all I saw." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She's staying at the hotel, Marjorie Pullen's place." He paused. "She asked Roy about you, about who was cooking at Boone Ranch." "Roy tell her?" "Roy told her your name and that you were a first-rate cook." A pause. "She asked if you were pretty." Martha stopped rolling. She started again. "What did Roy say?" she said. Roy said you were the best cook in 3 counties and let her draw her own conclusions. Danny watched her work. I thought you should know she's here. I appreciate it, she said. He finished his coffee and left. She kept rolling. She was not naive about what Vivian Cross being in Black Hollow meant. She was not naive about what her own position on the ranch looked like from the outside, a widow cook, heavy-set and plain, living in the main house. She knew how that story went. She'd watched other people's stories long enough to know how they went. What she hadn't prepared herself for was the encounter being on her own ground. Vivian Cross came to Boone Ranch 2 days after she arrived in Black Hollow. She rode up in the late morning on a horse that was better than most of the horses in the territory, wearing a coat that cost more than Martha's root cellar full of supplies. Martha saw her from the kitchen window, saw Silas go out to meet her in the yard, saw the conversation that happened in the cold with their breath making small clouds between them, saw the way Vivian looked at the house. She turned away from the window. She had bread to check. The knock on the kitchen door came about 20 minutes later, while Silas and Vivian were still in the yard. Martha knew before she opened it that it wasn't going to be anything comfortable. Vivian Cross stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression that Martha had no particular trouble reading. It was the expression of a woman who had walked into a room to confirm a suspicion and found the suspicion confirmed in a way that was worse than she'd expected. She looked at Martha. All of Martha, slowly, with the kind of thoroughness that was designed to be felt. "You must be the cook," she said. "I am," Martha said. Vivian looked around the kitchen. She looked at the work table, the stores, the arrangement of tools above the range that Martha had reorganized in the first week because the previous arrangement made no sense. She looked at the small personal touches that had accumulated without Martha particularly intending them. The dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, the crock of sourdough starter on the corner of the work table, the mended curtain over the window that she'd fixed because the original was letting cold air in. "You've made yourself comfortable," Vivian said. "I have a job to do," Martha said. "Doing it properly requires being settled." Vivian's gaze came back to her face. "Silas always was good at finding people who were useful," she said. The word useful was shaped carefully enough to land where she intended it to. Martha looked at her. She thought about the child in the blizzard, about the fence post she'd nearly lost, about the 11 men who ate better than they had in 2 years and worked better for it. She thought about Tom Greer's face over a bowl of stew, and Pete Caldwell's pine sparrow, and the coffee cup she'd left on the corner of a desk before dawn. "Mrs. Cross," she said, "I have a noon meal to prepare. If you've come to speak with Mr. Boone, he's in the yard." Vivian smiled with her mouth only. "I've already spoken with him," she said. "I was curious to see what he's been occupying himself with." "And now you've seen," Martha said. "Indeed." She looked around the kitchen one more time. "It must be comfortable," she said, "having a home to live in, even if it belongs to someone else. Not everyone gets that, at your stage of life." Martha set down the spoon she was holding. She turned to face Vivian fully. "Mrs. Cross," she said, keeping her voice level, "I've been managing my own home and my own life for a long time. I don't need anyone's assessment of it, if you'll excuse me." She picked the spoon back up and went to the stove. Vivian stood in the doorway for another moment. Martha could feel her standing there, could feel the precise calculation being made. And then she heard the click of good boot heels on the porch boards, and she was gone. Martha stood at the stove and gripped the spoon handle and breathed. She was not shaking. She was not going to shake. What she was tired. The specific tiredness of having spent 34 years being told in various languages and with various degrees of subtlety that she didn't quite make the cut, that she was at best useful and at worst invisible, that the space she took up was a minor inconvenience that decent people had learned to work around. She was tired of it in a way that had weight to it. She heard the door to the yard open, and Silas came in from the cold, stomping snow from his boots. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing that hasn't happened before," she said. "Martha." It was the first time he'd used her name, her actual name, not Mrs. Keegan. She turned around. "She came in here," he said. It wasn't a question. Something in his jaw had set in a way she hadn't seen before. "She was curious," Martha said. "It's understandable. A woman comes to a ranch she used to know and finds a stranger in the kitchen. I'd be curious too." What did she say? Nothing of consequence. She turned back to the stove. Mr. Boone, I need to start on the meal. If you have something to discuss, it can wait until Martha. There it was again, her name, and something about the way he said it, not unkindly, not with anything except directness, made her stop. You don't have to protect me from what she said. She stood at the stove with her back to him. She implied that my position here is an indulgence, she said, that I'm at a stage of life that requires charity. She was precise about it. She paused. She's a woman who knows how to land a thing. She heard him cross the kitchen floor. He stopped behind her. Not close, a respectful distance, but present. She doesn't have standing to say anything about this ranch, he said, or about anyone on it. She thinks she does, Martha said. And people in town are going to agree with her. A woman like that comes back, and a man like you. She stopped herself. A man like me, what? She shook her head. She's beautiful, and she's well situated, and she was here first, Martha said, more quietly. I'm the cook. Those are just facts. They're not the only facts, he said. She didn't answer. She started on the noon meal, moving through the steps of it with the efficiency of someone who has done the work enough times that it lives in the body rather than the mind. Silas stayed in the kitchen for another minute. She could feel him there, that specific presence of a person who has more to say and is holding it. And then he went out. She cooked. The bread came out well. The stew was good. The men ate and went back to work, and Jacob's mother had come for him 2 days ago, and the kitchen was quieter without him. And the blizzard that had seemed like the worst thing was already becoming something that had happened rather than something still happening. That evening, after supper, sitting at her kitchen table with the lamp low and the sound of the house around her, Martha thought very seriously about leaving, not in a panicked way. Practically. She thought about what she would take and how she would transport it, and whether Agnes had adjusted enough to the barn that moving her again would be a problem. She thought about her cabin on the eastern edge of town, which was hers, which was waiting for her, where nobody's opinion of her had any weight. She sat with that thought for a long time. Then she thought about the look on Silas Boone's face when he'd come in from the cold and found her at the stove. She thought about Martha, the way her name had sounded in his mouth. Not like a form of address, like a thing he actually knew. She thought about Tom Greer saying, "You're the best thing that's happened to this outfit in about 2 years, and not just because of the food." She thought about the boy in the blizzard. She thought about the fence post she'd found in the white and held on to until she had her footing again. She was not ready to let go of the fence post yet. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. Down the hall, the house settled into its nighttime sounds, and in the main room, the lamp at Silas Boone's desk burned until sometime after midnight. And in Black Hollow's one hotel, Vivian Cross sat in the good chair by the window and looked out at the frozen street and thought about what she'd seen in a kitchen that morning. The herbs and the sourdough and the mended curtain and the large plain-faced woman who had told her, "If you'll excuse me," with the serenity of someone who was not going to be moved. And she thought about Silas Boone's face in the yard when he'd looked at the main house. And she pressed her lips together and started planning. Vivian Cross was not a woman who made her moves quickly. Martha had expected something immediate, the kind of confrontation that announced itself. What she got instead was a campaign, which was more sophisticated and more wearing. Vivian began appearing in town on the days when Silas made his supply runs, which were the same days every week, because Silas was a man of habit. She would be at Haggerty's or outside the feed store or coming out of the hotel at the precise moment his wagon came down the main street, and there would be a conversation. And Martha would hear about it secondhand from Danny Rowe or from Roy Haggerty himself, who was constitutionally incapable of not mentioning things. She also began talking. Not loudly, not crudely. Vivian Cross was too precise for that. She talked in the way that certain women talked, quietly and to the right people, so that things moved through a community the way water moved through soil. You couldn't see it happening, but you could see what it produced. What it produced, in this case, was a specific set of observations that circulated through Black Hollow's small social world. That Silas Boone, struggling to keep his operation afloat, had taken a peculiar approach to solving his problems. That a woman of Martha Keegan's description and background living under the same roof as a widower rancher was a situation that decent people might raise an eyebrow at. That whatever Martha's cooking skills, there was a question of appearances that a man with Silas's standing ought to consider. Martha heard these observations the way she heard most things, through the texture of how people looked at her when she came to town, the slight extra beat before a greeting, the way a conversation shifted when she walked into Haggerty's. Clara Hess, who had made the comment at the church social 2 years ago that Martha hadn't been able to swallow, was now finding reasons to be visible whenever Martha was in the store. She absorbed it. She had spent 34 years building the capacity to absorb things and keep moving, and she used that capacity now. What she couldn't absorb as cleanly was the afternoon Vivian came to the ranch again, and this time she didn't come to the kitchen. She came to the yard on a Saturday when most of the hands were in or around the barn doing maintenance work. She rode up on that good horse and dismounted with the ease of a woman who had been riding before she could walk, and she stood in the yard and called for Silas in a voice that carried. Silas came out of the barn. What followed happened in the open yard in front of 6 ranch hands, and Martha, who was at the side window of the kitchen and had no particular reason to stop watching. She couldn't hear everything. She caught pieces. Vivian's voice had that carrying quality even when she wasn't trying, and the wind was cooperative. She heard the whole valley is talking, and she heard you have to see how it looks, and she heard a man in your position, and then she heard Silas say something short that she couldn't make out, and Vivian's posture shifted, a small adjustment, the adjustment of someone recalibrating. And then Vivian said, clearly enough that the wind brought it whole to Martha's window, "Silas, look at her honestly. You know what she is. She's useful, the way a good horse is useful. You don't build a life around a horse." Martha stepped away from the window. She stood in the middle of her kitchen. The pot on the stove needed stirring. She picked up the spoon and stirred it. She set the spoon down. She picked it back up. She heard Silas's voice outside, and whatever he said this time was not short. She didn't hear the words. She heard the tone, which was the tone of a man who has been patient and has reached the end of the patience. She heard Vivian say something else, and then there was silence, and then the sound of a horse being turned and ridden out of the yard at a pace that was not leisurely. She was still standing at the stove when Silas came into the kitchen. She heard him come in. She heard him stop. She kept her eyes on the pot. "Martha," he said. "I'm making the noon meal," she said. "I know." He didn't go away. "How much of that did you hear?" "Enough," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, not agitated, not the breathing of a man who is still in the middle of something, but the deliberate breathing of someone who is choosing words carefully. "She's wrong," he said. "She's not entirely wrong," Martha said. "People are talking. That's real. And your ranch has enough problems without—" "Martha." The words stopped her. "I need you to hear me. Not the version of this that runs through your head at night, where you've already decided what it means. The actual thing I'm saying." A pause. "She is wrong. About what you are. About what this is. She is wrong." Martha turned around. He was standing near the door with his hat in his hands, and he looked like what he was. A man who had been running an operation in hard country for 15 years, who had been carrying a weight for the past year that showed in the set of his shoulders, who was tired in a way that had been partially addressed and not entirely solved. He did not look like a man making a pretty speech. He looked like a man who had something true to say and was working out how to say it without overstating it. "She called you useful like a horse," he said. "I want you to understand that I know what you are. You're not useful to me the way a horse is useful. A horse I can replace. What you've done for this outfit, for these men, for the morale, for the way this place feels when I walk into it at the end of a hard day, I can't replace that. I don't want to." She looked at him. She thought about all the things she had been told she was over the years and how she had filed them away and kept moving. She thought about how few people in her life had looked at her the way he was looking at her right now. Like she was not a problem to be managed, but a person to be reckoned with. "Silas," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Whatever you're feeling, whatever this is, I need you to think about it carefully, because I am not a woman people expect you to choose. And I have enough self-respect to tell you that directly, rather than let it become a thing we don't say." He held her gaze. "I've thought about it," he said. "I've been thinking about it since you told me you were tired of being invisible. I'm not a man who decides things quickly, but when I decide them, I mean them." He stopped. "I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm telling you that Vivian Cross doesn't get to define what you are to this ranch or to me. That's all." She nodded. She didn't trust herself to say more than that. He put his hat back on and went out to the yard, and she turned back to the stove, and her hands were not steady, but the pot didn't care about that. Bam. What happened the following Saturday was not something Silas had planned. Martha would think about that later. Whether he had decided in advance to do what he did, or whether it was the kind of thing that happened when a person had been patient long enough and the patience simply ran out. There was a gathering at Haggerty's store. Not a formal event. It happened most Saturdays, a half dozen or more people from the surrounding ranches and farms coming in for supplies and staying to talk. The way small settlements had always turned commerce into community, because they didn't have the luxury of keeping the two things separate. Silas had gone to town for supplies. Several of the ranch hands had gone with him. Martha had gone because she needed specific things that she could only judge by looking at them herself. A particular grade of dried beans, lamp oil of a quality that didn't smoke. Vivian Cross was there. She had timed it, Martha thought, with the precision of someone who had been thinking about timing. She was at the counter when they arrived, talking to Clara Hess, and she turned when the door opened with an expression of mild surprise that Martha recognized as manufactured. The store had maybe 8 people in it. Roy Haggerty behind the counter, Clara Hess, 2 farmers Martha knew by sight. Tom Greer had come with the wagon and stood near the door. Danny Rowe and Hank Pryor were there. Silas moved to the counter to go over his order with Roy, and Martha moved toward the shelves with her own list, and Vivian watched all of this with the specific attentiveness of someone who has prepared for a scene. "Martha," Vivian said. Her voice was warm and entirely false. "How are things at the ranch? Keeping busy?" Martha looked at the beans. "Well enough," she said. "I imagine it's demanding work," Vivian said. She moved slightly, positioning herself where the full store could hear without appearing to project. "Feeding so many men, though I suppose at a certain point it becomes habit, like any kind of domestic service." The phrase landed exactly where she'd aimed it. Domestic service. Not cooking, not feeding a ranch through a hard winter. Domestic service. The kind of work you hired people to do when you didn't want to think about them. Clara Hess made a small sound that might have been agreement. Martha kept looking at the beans. "And how is Black Hollow treating you, Mrs. Cross?" she said. "I imagine after San Francisco this must feel—" She paused, considering the word. "Modest." Vivian's eyes sharpened. "I grew up here," she said. "It's home." "Of course," Martha said. "I've been catching up with old friends," Vivian said, and her voice shifted into something that was still warm but had edges now. "Everyone's been so kind, so concerned about Silas, with the ranch having such a difficult year. It's hard to watch someone you care about struggle, especially when the solutions he's found aren't perhaps the most sustainable." She looked at Martha as she said solutions. She looked at her the way she'd looked at her in the kitchen that first day. All of her, slowly, the look that was designed to make a woman feel like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be addressed. "I think what Silas needs," Vivian continued, "is someone who can help him rebuild what the ranch used to be. Someone with the right connections, the right—" "Vivian." It was Silas's voice from the counter. He had turned around. He was not loud and he was not angry in any theatrical sense. He had the particular stillness of a man who is not going to be moved and knows it. The store went quiet. Roy Haggerty set down the paper he'd been writing on. Silas crossed the store floor unhurried, and he stopped between Martha and Vivian in a way that was not aggressive but was entirely deliberate. "I'll say this once," he said, and he said it to the room as much as to Vivian, because he was not a man who liked to repeat himself, and he was not going to. "Martha Keegan came to my ranch 6 weeks ago when I needed help, and she gave it. She walked out into a blizzard to pull a child from the cold. She has kept 11 men fed and working through the worst winter in a decade. She has done more for that operation than any amount of connection or social standing could do." He paused. "She is not domestic service. She is not a solution to a problem. She is the reason my ranch is still functioning." Another pause, shorter. "And she is none of your business, Vivian. She never was." The room held its breath. Vivian's face had gone still in the way of a woman who has been outmaneuvered and is deciding how to absorb it. Clara Hess was not making any sounds at all. Roy Haggerty appeared to have found something very interesting to look at on the ceiling. Silas turned to Martha. He looked at her with the same directness he'd used on her front porch the first day, when he'd told her he wasn't looking for someone beautiful, like she was a person who deserved to be seen clearly. "You ready?" he said. "We still have to get the lamp oil." She looked at him. She thought about the fence post in the blizzard, the one she'd held until she found her footing. She thought about the cup of coffee she'd left on the corner of his desk before dawn, and how she hadn't known why she'd done it and did now. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." They finished the shopping. The room behind them slowly released its held breath, and conversations resumed in the careful way that conversations resumed when something significant had just happened, and nobody was quite sure yet what to do with it. Martha kept her eyes on her list and her hands on her tasks, and she did not let herself think about what had just happened until they were outside and the door had closed behind them. Then she stopped on the porch. "Silas," she said. He was loading a crate into the wagon bed. He looked up. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "People are going to talk." "People were already talking," he said. "At least now they're talking about something true." She stood on the porch for a moment in the cold, feeling something large and complicated and not entirely comfortable moving through her chest. She had spent so many years managing how much she wanted, keeping it small and practical and within reach, that the feeling of wanting something large was almost physical. It had weight, it had resistance, it pushed back against the old habits. "Lamp oil," she said. "Third store down," he said, and went back to loading. They were 4 days past the scene at Haggerty's store when Tom Greer didn't come to breakfast. This was notable because Tom Greer had come to every breakfast since Martha arrived. He was the most habitual man she had ever met. Same time, same chair, same cup, same amount of coffee. When his chair was empty at 6 in the morning, she registered it before she registered anything else. She sent Hank Pryor to check on him. Hank came back in 5 minutes with a look on his face that she had not seen before. "He's bad," he said. "Burning up. Can't hardly talk." She was out the door before he finished the sentence. Tom Greer was in his bunk, and he was the color of old ash, the same color the men had been when they came in from the worst day of the blizzard, except those men had been cold and Tom was the opposite of cold. He was running a fever that she could feel from 6 inches away. His breathing was shallow and fast, and when she put her hand on his forehead, he didn't fully register that she was there. "How long?" she said to the room in general. "Will Caldwell, from the next bunk. He said something last night about feeling off. I thought he meant his back. It's been bothering him. Why didn't anyone—" She stopped herself. That conversation was for later. "Who else in here has been feeling poorly?" Silence. Then Pete from the back. "I had a headache yesterday. Thought it was the cold." She looked at the bunkhouse, the close quarters, the shared surfaces, the communal water bucket that everyone drank from. She had been cooking for ranch outfits long enough and living through enough frontier winters to know what this looked like. She went to get Silas. She found him at the barn and she said, "I need you to send someone for the doctor in Mill Haven, right now, and I need you to move Tom Greer to the house." She paused. "I think it's spreading." He looked at her face. He didn't ask how sure she was. "Danny," he said to Danny Rowe, who was standing nearby, "take the fast horse. Don't stop." By evening, 3 men were down, Tom Greer, Pete Caldwell, and a man named Garrett, who had been the quietest of the outfit and who Martha had learned was the only one who took sugar in his coffee and who now could not keep water down. They were in the main house, and 2 of the rooms Silas had cleared out, because the bunkhouse was too cold and too communal, and Martha needed to be able to move between them without going outside. The doctor from Mill Haven arrived the following afternoon, a tall, spare man named Aldous Crane, who had the manner of someone who had seen most things and been alarmed by few of them. He looked at all 3 patients, asked Martha a series of questions in a clipped, efficient way, and then said, "Influenza. Serious but manageable if you keep them warm, keep fluid in them, and watch for the lungs going bad. If the breathing changes, faster, wetter, you send for me again immediately." "What can I give them?" Martha said. He told her. Some of it she already knew. Some of it she wrote down. When he left, Silas stood in the hallway looking at the 2 closed doors. "Will they be all right?" he said. "If I do this right," Martha said. "Tom worries me most. He's the oldest and he was already run down." She looked at Silas. "I need broth. Good broth, not water with a bone in it, for all 3 of them every 2 hours. I need the fires in those rooms kept hot through the night. I need clean rags, and I need the water boiled before it goes to them. I need someone checking on them every hour. Tell me what to do, Silas said simply. She told him. What followed was 4 days that she would not choose to repeat. She slept in 2-hour intervals between rounds of the patients. She kept broth going on the stove continuously, a rolling production of chicken and later beef, cooked long and strained and salted and kept warm. She monitored Tom Greer with the specific attention of someone who knows that an old man with a fever and compromised lungs is a situation where the margin for error is very thin. On the second night, his breathing changed. She heard it from the hallway. That slight wetness, the quality she'd been listening for. She was in his room in 60 seconds, hand on his chest, feeling the rattle of it, and she went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the house. She did the things Dr. Crane had told her to do. She kept him propped up to ease the lungs. She made a steam compress from the herbs she'd brought from her own stores, dried thyme and eucalyptus bark, things her mother had used, things she knew worked even if she couldn't have explained the mechanism. She sat beside him through the rest of that night, not sleeping, watching his chest rise and fall. Silas found her there at 4 a.m. He came in quietly, looked at Tom, looked at her. Go sleep, he said. I'll sit with him. I'm fine, she said. Martha. He said it with the same flatness he used when he'd decided something and wasn't revisiting it. You're not going to help him by collapsing. Go sleep for 2 hours. I'll call you if anything changes. She looked at Tom, who was breathing. Still wet, still too fast, but breathing. She looked at Silas, who was standing by the bedside with his arms folded in the way of a man who was not going to be argued with. She went and lay down for 2 hours. When she came back, Silas was still in the chair beside Tom's bed. Tom's breathing had not gotten worse. Silas looked up when she came in, and there were shadows under his eyes that told her he hadn't slept either, which meant he'd lied to her about the sleeping part, but she found she couldn't be angry about it. By the 3rd day, Pete Caldwell's fever broke. By the 4th day, Garrett was sitting up and asking for real food, which Martha took as the most reliable indicator that a man was recovering, when he started complaining about the broth and wanting something with substance. Tom Greer took another 2 days. She sat with him on the 5th evening, while the rest of the house was quiet and the other 2 men were on the mend and the crisis had shifted from acute to something more like slow work. He was awake, which he hadn't been reliably for 4 days, and he was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man taking inventory. Tom, she said. He turned his head. His eyes were clearer than they'd been. You're going to be irritating about this, he said. His voice was a thread, but it was his voice. You're going to want to talk about what I eat and how much I rest. For at least 2 more weeks, she confirmed. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. Thought so. He was quiet for a moment. You stayed up. Someone had to. Silas, too. Yes. He turned back to the ceiling. 40 years on cattle outfits, he said. Never had a cook sit up with me when I was sick. He paused. The others either. I'm aware, she said. I know you're aware. He closed his eyes. Just saying it out loud. She sat with him until he slept, which was not long. Then she went to the kitchen and stood at the cold stove and put her forehead down on her hands on the work table and let herself be, for exactly 1 minute, completely exhausted. 1 minute. Then she straightened up and put the kettle on. Hot. On the 6th day, Hank Pryor came down with it. And on the 7th, Danny Rowe. She went back to the beginning. The broth, the compresses, the 2-hour sleep intervals. Silas spelled her when she let him, which was not as often as he thought she should let him. And they argued about this in the low voices of people who were too tired to argue loudly and were doing it anyway, because the argument was a way of saying things that were harder to say directly. You're not sleeping enough, he said, on the 8th night, finding her in the kitchen at 2 a.m. Neither are you, she said. I'm not running this operation single-handed. You're running half of it, she said. The men aren't going to feed themselves, and the horses need— I know what the horses need, he said, with an edge that was tiredness more than impatience. Martha, what do you need? She stopped. Nobody asked her that. People asked what she needed for the patients, what she needed for the kitchen, what she needed for the work. They didn't ask what she needed. She looked at him across the kitchen, this man with the shadows under his eyes and the coat he'd been wearing for 3 days, and the set of shoulders that had been carrying something for longer than this week. "I need Tom to keep improving," she said. "I need Hank's fever to break by tomorrow. I need Danny to stop being stubborn about the broth and actually drink it." "And for yourself," he said. "What do you need for yourself?" She was quiet for a moment. "I need to get through this first," she said. "And then I'll tell you." He looked at her. He nodded once, the nod of a man who accepts an answer that is not yet complete because he understands there is more coming. He poured her a cup of coffee from the pot she'd made an hour ago. He set it on the work table beside her. He went back down the hall to check on the patients. She wrapped her hands around the cup. She drank it. She went back to work. On the 9th day, Hank Pryor's fever broke. On the 10th, Danny Rose sat up in bed and said, with considerable feeling, that if he saw one more cup of broth, he was going to do something drastic. And Martha told him he could have bread and soft eggs in the morning if he got through the next 12 hours without a fever spike. And he said, "Yes, ma'am," in the tone of a man making a sacred oath. She sat down in the kitchen chair that night, the chair at the work table, not the comfortable one. And she realized she didn't have the energy to get up and go to her room. She sat there. After a while, the kitchen door opened and Silas came in from his last round of the night. He stopped when he saw her. He took his coat off. She registered this dimly, and he put it around her shoulders, and then he sat down in the chair across the work table, and he just sat there with her, in the quiet kitchen, in the middle of the night, while the house breathed around them. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. After a while, her eyes closed. When she woke up in the gray early morning, there was a folded blanket over her, and the coat was still around her shoulders, and Silas was not there. But the kitchen fire had been laid, and the kindling was ready to light, and the water barrel was full. She had forgotten to fill it the night before, and he had filled it without being asked. She sat still for a moment in the early quiet, with the coat around her shoulders that smelled of cold air and work, and something she had no practical use for naming. Then she got up. She lit the fire. She started the broth. The last of the sick men got up on their own feet on a Thursday. Danny Rowe was the final one to clear. He'd had it the hardest after Tom, and he'd fought the recovery the way he fought most things, with a stubborn resistance that made him a difficult patient and would probably make him a long-lived man. He came to the breakfast table looking like something that had been left out in the weather, thin in the face and moving carefully, but he came. He sat down. He ate the eggs Martha put in front of him with the focused attention of someone reacquainting himself with the simple pleasure of food that was not broth. When he finished, he set down his fork and looked at her across the table. "Mrs. Keegan," he said, "Danny, I want you to know something." He said it plainly, without ceremony, because Danny Rowe was not a man who added decoration to things. "I've worked cattle outfits from here to the Montana line. I've had good outfits and bad ones. I've had cooks who could cook and cooks who couldn't. I've never had anyone—" He stopped, started again. "What you did for us. While you were sick yourself." Martha looked at him. "I wasn't sick." "You lost 8 pounds, he said. "Tom told me." He could see it. He held her gaze. "You don't have to make less of it. We all know what it cost." She didn't say anything. She picked up his empty plate and took it to the basin. "I just wanted to say it out loud," he said, "because somebody should." She kept her back to the table so he wouldn't see her face doing what it was doing. "Eat something else," she said. "You need more than eggs." She heard him reach for the bread, and that was that, and she was grateful for it. Tom Greer took another week to get fully on his feet, and even then he moved with a new caution, like a man who had been shown something about the limits of his body that he hadn't wanted to know. She watched him during those days with the attention she'd maintained through the worst of the illness, looking for the breathing to change, for the color in his face to go wrong again. It didn't. He improved in the slow, unspectacular way that real recovery happened, not in a rush, but in increments so small you almost missed them until you compared Tuesday to the Tuesday before and realized the distance traveled. On his first full day out of the house, he came to the kitchen in the late afternoon and sat at the table and watched her work in silence for a while, the way he used to before any of this happened. The normalcy of it caught her somewhere in the chest. "You're staring," she said. "I know," he said, thinking. "About what?" He was quiet for another moment. "About what this place looked like when I rode in 11 years ago," he said. "Cold, functional, Silas running it like a machine because that was the only way he knew. Good ranch, good man, but he paused. Empty in a way I couldn't have put words to then. She kept working. She knew he wasn't done. It's not empty now, he said. Hasn't been, since November. He looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. You know what you did here, don't you? Not the cooking, not even the sick men. What you actually did. Tom, she said, with a note of warning. I'm saying it anyway, he said, which was the most defiant she'd ever heard him. You made it a place worth coming back to. There's a difference between a ranch where men work and a ranch where men want to work. You made it the second kind. That's not a small thing. She put down the knife she was holding. She stood at the work table and looked at the wall above the stove for a moment. I made food, she said. You made people feel like they were worth feeding, he said. That's not the same thing and you know it. She picked the knife back up. She started on the carrots. Go rest, she said. You're supposed to be resting. I rested for 10 days, he said. I'm done resting. But he got up, and before he went out, he stopped in the doorway. Silas is trying to figure out how to say something to you, he said, in case you hadn't noticed. I'm telling you because he's slow about these things, and I don't have the patience to wait and see if he gets there on his own. He went out. She stood at the work table and cut carrots for a long time after that, and when she'd cut all the carrots she needed, she kept cutting them smaller until she made herself stop and put the knife down and stand still. Silas came to her that evening. The hands had eaten and gone back to the bunkhouse, and the house had settled into its quiet, and she was at the kitchen table with her mending, a habit she'd carried from her cabin, the evening mending, the kind of work that let her hands be busy while her mind went wherever it needed to go. She heard his boots in the hall. She recognized his particular way of moving, which was something she'd registered without quite deciding to. He came into the kitchen and he didn't sit down immediately. He stood near the door with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at her with the expression she'd cataloged over the past 3 months. The one where he had something to say and was finding his way to it. She kept mending. She gave him the room to get there. Martha, he said. Silas. A pause. I want to say something, and I want to say it correctly, so bear with me if it takes a minute. All right, she said. He pulled out the chair across the table from her and sat down. He put his hands on the table, not folded, just flat on the wood, like a man grounding himself. When I came to your door in November, he said, I came because I needed a cook. That was true. Roy Haggerty told me you were the best he'd seen, and I believed him, and I needed what you could do, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise because you'd see through it, and I'd rather not start something by being dishonest. She glanced up from the mending. He was looking at the table, not at her. But something changed, he said. Not all at once. In the way things actually change, which is slowly, and then you look up one day and it's done. He looked up now. I don't know exactly when I stopped thinking about you as the cook. I know it was before the blizzard, maybe before that first week was out. A pause. I know it was the morning you left coffee on my desk without saying anything about it. I don't know why that was the thing, but it was. She set the mending down. I've been running this ranch for 15 years, he said. I've been alone for most of it, and I made a kind of peace with that, the way you make peace with the things you can't change. I told myself I was practical, that I wasn't built for the other kind of life, the kind with someone else in it. He stopped. Vivian was, He stopped again. That was a long time ago, and it was never what I thought it was. I see that clearly now. Silas, she said. Let me finish, he said. I've been trying to say this for 3 weeks, and Tom Greer just told me I needed to stop thinking about it and say it, so I'm saying it. She almost smiled. Tom told you that. He did, in more words than he usually uses, which tells me he means it. He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to tell you that I stopped noticing what people think. I'm a man who lives in a community, and what people think has consequences, and I'm not naive about that. But I also know that I spent 10 days watching you keep my men alive when you had nothing left. And I know that when I came into the kitchen at 2 a.m. and found you falling asleep at the table, I put my coat around you because I could not stand the idea of you being cold. And I know that is not how I feel about my cook. The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him. This man who was not beautiful and not easy and not uncomplicated, who ran a ranch by force of will through a year that had tried to take everything from him, who had put a coat around her shoulders without waking her and laid the fire and filled the water barrel and not said a word about it. "I am not easy to be with," she said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I have opinions about everything, and I'm not quiet about them, and I don't bend when I think I'm right." "I know," he said. "People are going to talk. They're already talking." "They are," he said. "And in 6 months, they'll find something else to talk about. People do." "I'm plain, Silas. I'm going to be plain in 6 months and in 6 years." He looked at her with an expression that was not impatient, but was very direct. "Martha," he said, "I know what you look like. I've known what you look like since the day I rode up to your cabin. That is not the thing I'm sitting here talking to you about." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands on the mending, then at him. "I told you I'd tell you what I needed for myself," she said, "after we got through it." "I remember," he said. "I need to not be invisible," she said. "That's the plain version of it. I spent most of my life being invisible, and I'm tired of it in a way that has gotten into my bones. I need to be in a place where I'm seen, not admired, not perfect, just seen." She paused. "You've done that since November. I don't know if you knew you were doing it." "I knew," he said quietly. She nodded. She picked up the mending and then set it down again because her hands weren't going to be useful for that right now. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right, meaning all right," she said. "Meaning I'm not going to pretend I haven't felt this too, because I have. And I'm too old and too tired to be coy about things that matter." She met his eyes. "Meaning we should be careful and honest and not stupid about it, because both of us have enough sense to know that feeling something and building something are different tasks." "Agreed," he said. "And meaning," she said, "that if you want to start, we start." He sat with that for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, more like the release of something that had been held for a long time. "Then we start," he said. Town. Spring came the way it always came to that valley. Not all at once, but in negotiations. A week of cold followed by 3 warm days, followed by a freeze that felt like a personal insult. And then gradually, grudgingly, the temperature holding above freezing long enough for the creek to loosen and the mud to come back and the first pale grass to push through what the winter had left behind. The ranch came back with it. Not all at once. That wasn't how ranches worked, and Martha had enough experience with the rhythms of working land to know that recovery was slow and uneven, and you had to resist the urge to call it done before it was done. But the cattle that had made it through the winter were in better condition than Silas had dared to hope. He'd managed the feed better than the year before, with some guidance from Martha on the rationing that he'd absorbed without making a production of accepting. And the south pasture that had flooded the previous spring had drained properly this time and was showing good grass. Danny Rowe, fully recovered and more talkative than he'd been before the illness, as if the fever had loosened something in him, started talking to Silas about expanding the operation in a specific direction, a way station. The road that ran past the northern edge of Boone Ranch had more traffic on it every year, freighters and settlers and cattle drives passing through, and there was no proper stop between Black Hollow and the next town 20 miles north. A place where travelers could get a hot meal and a night's rest and feed for their animals was a thing that would pay for itself inside a season. Silas listened. He thought about it for a week, the way he thought about everything. Then he came to Martha. "The way station idea," he said. "I want your read on it." "Danny's been talking to you," she said. "He has." He sat at the kitchen table he did that more now, sat in the kitchen while she worked, in the easy way of 2 people who had gotten used to each other's presence. It would mean more work, different work, not just the outfit. "I know," she said. "It would also mean your name on it," he said. "Your cooking is what would draw people, not the beds, not the location, though that's good. The food." She turned from the stove and looked at him. "My name on it," she said. "Joint venture," he said, "if you want it that way." A pause. "I've been thinking about the legal arrangement. Roy Haggerty knows a man who draws up these kinds of agreements. It would be yours as much as mine." She stood at the stove for a long moment. She thought about her cabin on the eastern edge of town, which she still owned, which was still hers. She thought about the 12 acres of rocky land and the cast-iron stove she'd inherited from her mother. She thought about what it had meant for 34 years to have a thing that was hers. "All right," she said, "but I want to approve the menu." He almost smiled. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. They were married in June on a Tuesday, which was not a traditionally celebrated day for weddings, but which suited both of them precisely because it made no fuss about itself. Roy Haggerty witnessed. Tom Greer witnessed, leaning on a cane he was still using and would use for another month, his face arranged in the expression of a man who has been proved right about something and is being decent enough not to say so. The hands were there, all of them, in varying states of cleaned up. Hank Pryor had made an effort with his hair that Martha found genuinely touching. Pete Caldwell had finished the pine sparrow he'd been working on for weeks and gave it to her after the ceremony, wrapped in a piece of cloth, without making a speech about it. Just handed it over and went and stood with his brothers, and she held it in both hands and looked at it until she trusted her face again. Danny Rose shook Silas's hand and then turned to Martha and said, "You've got more patience than I would," which was the closest thing to a romantic sentiment she'd heard from him, and which made her laugh in a way she hadn't laughed in a long time. Vivian Cross had left Black Hollow in February. She had gone back to San Francisco, or somewhere like it. Nobody was entirely sure of the details, and nobody pressed for them. She left the way she had come, on that good horse, and the town closed around her absence the way towns did, and within a month the space she'd occupied in the local conversation had been filled with other things. Martha did not think about her often. When she did, she thought about her without bitterness, which was something she was proud of. Not because bitterness was unwarranted, but because carrying it would have cost more than it returned. But the way station opened in August. It was not grand. It was an added room built onto the east side of the main house, with 4 tables and a long bench along one wall and a window that looked out toward the creek. Martha had a say in every element of it. From the table spacing, she'd worked in enough cramped eating spaces to know that people needed room to feel comfortable, to the arrangement of the kitchen addition, which was larger than the original and designed around her specific ways of working. The sign outside was Silas's doing. He'd had it made in town by the man who did the lettering on storefronts, and he'd told her about it the day it went up, but not what it said, which annoyed her. She went outside and looked at it. Boone's Way Station. And below, in smaller letters, M. Boone, Proprietor. She stood in front of it for a moment in the August sun. "You could have told me what it said," she said. "I wanted you to see it," he said from behind her. She looked at it a while longer. M. Boone, Proprietor. A name. Her name, on a sign, on a thing that was hers. She had not thought at 34, standing in her drafty cabin on the eastern edge of town with her cold tea and her practical expectations, that this was a thing that was going to happen to her. She had not thought a lot of things were going to happen to her. "It's good," she said. "It is," he agreed. She went inside. She had a noon meal to prepare, and the first wagon of the day had already turned off the road. The travelers who stopped at Boone's Way Station that first season ranged from freighters hauling goods between settlements to families in wagons with everything they owned, heading somewhere they believed would be better. Martha fed all of them. She fed them the way she had always fed people. With attention, with the understanding that a meal made by someone who gave a damn tasted different from one that didn't, even when the ingredients were the same. She learned things from the people who passed through. She learned which routes were passable in which seasons, which settlements up north were growing and which were struggling, which goods were in short supply, and which were moving in such quantities that the price was dropping. She stored this information the way she stored root vegetables, carefully, organized, against future use. Silas watched her do this and said, one evening in the fall of their first married year, "You could run a trading post." "I know," she said. "Is that something you want?" She thought about it. "Not yet," she said. "Maybe in 3 years." She was making pie crust, her hands in the flour, the familiar resistance of the dough. The way station needs to be established first. People need to know it's reliable before they trust it for business. He looked at her across the kitchen. "You've thought about this." "I think about most things," she said. "You know that." He did know that. He had been married to her for 5 months, and he knew, among other things, that she thought about things before she said them, that she kept her own counsel on matters she wasn't ready to decide, that she was slower to anger than he'd expected and faster to laugh than she showed in public, and that she had a capacity for stubbornness that matched his own in ways that were sometimes inconvenient and mostly made things work. He also knew that she still got up before 4 in the morning, still laid the kitchen fire herself, still checked the stores every Sunday, with the systematic attention of someone who had learned early that running out of things had consequences. These habits were not things she'd stop. They were things she'd built herself out of, and he'd learned not to mistake them for anxiousness. They were how she stayed herself. The woman who had been invisible in Black Hollow for years became, by the end of the first year of the way station, one of the people that Black Hollow knew about. Not famous, not celebrated in any dramatic sense. It was quieter than that and more real. People knew her name. People said, "Stop at Boone's, the food is the best you'll find in this part of the territory." Travelers who'd passed through once made a point of timing their routes to stop again. The families in the valley, some of whom had looked through her for years, started coming out on Sundays. Not every Sunday, but enough. It turned into a loose gathering, the kind that had no particular agenda except that people found themselves there and found it worth being. Clara Hess came once, in October, with her husband. She sat at one of the 4 tables and ate Martha's beef pie and drank her coffee, and when she was done, she said stiffly that it was very good. Martha said thank you and brought her more coffee. That was all. It was enough. What Black Hollow made of Martha Keegan Boone was not a transformation story. Not the kind with a clear before and after, where someone is revealed to have been something all along. It was slower and messier and more human than that. People revised their opinions in the gradual way that people revised opinions. Because the evidence accumulated and eventually outweighed what they'd assumed, and because some of them were decent enough to let the evidence do its work. Some weren't. That was true too. There were people in Black Hollow who looked at Martha Boone and saw what they'd always seen and weren't going to change it, and she understood this and did not exhaust herself trying to convert them. You couldn't spend your life auditioning for people who'd already made up their minds. She had learned this. It was a hard thing to learn, and she'd learned it anyway. What she had instead was this: a kitchen she'd arranged herself, a sign with her name on it, a husband who filled the water barrel without being asked, and who argued with her about decisions with the confidence of someone who respected what she'd argue back. Tom Greer, back on his feet and slightly slower than before, but still there, still arriving 5 minutes before the others, and drinking his coffee the same way he always had. Pete Caldwell's pine sparrow on the shelf above the kitchen window, where the light hit it in the late afternoon and threw a small shadow on the wall. A community of travelers and neighbors who came through the door and left having eaten something made with care. And Agnes, still in the barn, still philosophical about the whole arrangement. Takum. There is a thing that happens to people who have spent a long time being overlooked. It doesn't go away cleanly, even when the circumstances change. Martha knew this from the inside. She still had the mornings, still did, even a year into her marriage, even with the way station and the sign and Silas's hand on her shoulder in the evening, where the old voice was there when she woke up. The one that had been running its commentary since she was 12 years old. The one that knew all her weak points and knew where to press. She had learned over time that the voice didn't require a response. It required acknowledgement, and then it required being set aside. The way you set aside a tool you weren't currently using. It was there. It was not the only thing that was there. You did not have to choose one thing to be true. She thought sometimes about the woman she'd been in November, sitting at the kitchen table in her cabin with the cold tea, deciding whether to say yes to a man who'd knocked on her door because 2 other women had said no. She thought about what she would have told that woman if she could have. She would not have told her it all works out. That would have been too smooth, too convenient, too much like a story that had been cleaned up for telling. She would have told her something more honest and more useful. That the things you build when you finally stop making yourself smaller are not perfect, and they require more of you than the small life does. And there will be days when you regret stepping out of it. But the size of a life is not just measured by its comfort. It's measured by what it contained, by who sat at your table, by what you made with your hands that mattered to someone other than yourself. The woman in the cabin had spent a long time waiting to matter. She'd been waiting for something external to arrive and confirm it, a look, a word, an occasion. What she'd learned, slowly and not without pain, was that mattering was not a thing that got granted. It was a thing you built, out of the actual stuff of your days, in the company of people who were also just trying to get through theirs. She had built it, imperfectly and without grace and with more stubbornness than was probably necessary. She had built it. On the last evening of November, one full year from the day Silas Boone had ridden up to her porch with his hat in his hands, Martha Boone stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard. The first real freeze had come again. The creek would be icing over by morning. The cattle were in the barn, the horses settled, the way station empty for the night. The last travelers had moved on that afternoon. A freighter and his assistant who had eaten 2 full servings of the beef stew and left with a generosity that still surprised her when it happened. Silas came up behind her and stood there, not touching her, just present. That was something she'd gotten used to about him. The way he could be in a room with you without needing to fill it. Same time last year, he said. I know, she said. Cold then, too. Colder, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the yard was still and white, and the lamplight from the kitchen fell in a square across the frozen ground. Martha, he said. You doing all right? She looked out at the yard, at the barn where Agnes was, at the sign she couldn't see from this angle but knew was there. At the road that ran past the north edge of the property, empty now, but by spring, it would carry people again. People going somewhere, people coming back, people who would turn off the road when they saw the sign and come in hungry and go out fed. Yes, she said, and she meant it in the full sense of the word, the sense that included all the hard things and did not pretend they hadn't been hard. The sense that understood that a good life was not an easy one, but simply a real one, inhabited fully, with both hands, with the courage to stay when staying was the harder choice. She meant it the way a woman meant it when she had stopped waiting for someone to tell her she was worth something and had gone ahead and built the evidence herself. Yes, she said again, I'm all right. Outside, the freeze settled in over Black Hollow, and the night was clear and cold and full of stars, and in the kitchen the stove held its warmth, and the bread was set to rise by morning, and the sign above the door said what it said, and it was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough.